Speeding has gone up. I don't know if you've seen the graph from Manchester, which showed, Andy Burnham has showed this graph, that as car usage has gone down, speeding's gone up almost exactly in the same proportion. I think it's now 40% of drivers in Manchester are speeding. So it's really quite worrying. So people who might want to walk or cycle are being deterred. So what can we do? Well, looking at across the world, lots of other authorities across the world, cities across the world are doing loads of stuff. Tabitha Coombs at the University of North Carolina has published a really good blog about, really good Google Docs about what's happening. So, credit to her for doing that. And Berlin has even produced a guide as how to produce temporary cycle tracks. So what I've been doing is trying to highlight what other cities have been doing and then try and translate that into the UK legislation. And we don't have really the powers to do very much very quickly. So the actions that you could be doing is creating temporary pavements or walking spaces. You could be creating temporary cycle lanes. You could be closing roads off completely, which is what Hackney are talking about doing. And you can, the other thing you can do is suspend push button operations. So you don't actually have to push the button. Now, all these things are doable, but they all take time. And one of the things we've found out in legislation is you can't do things overnight, much as we'd like to. It's just not legally possible. But the quickest you can turn things around in is a week using an emergency traffic order. That's if you want to do it legally. You can just do it, and a council could just close off a road or do it and take the hit and see what happens. But some councils, I think, possibly even Hackney might be prepared to do that. Many want to actually try and have some semblance of legality. And the real shame is that digging into the nitty-gritty of the COVID Act, there were 3 words that could have been added to the COVID Act that would have made all this quite a lot easier. There is an exemption in the Highway Act for terrorism. And that's how, if you look at Westminster Bridge, London Bridge, how all those barriers have gone up. Authorities can act instantly if there is a terrorist attack or if they're worried about the risk of terrorism, to mitigate terrorism. If the words "and civil emergencies" had been added to that, then they could have acted on this. But they weren't added in the COVID bill, and that's the problem. So, one small campaign is to possibly get those 3 words, which would not take very much to get added. That would then allow authorities to do things. But at the moment, they have to work under the current rules, or, as I say, just take the law into their own hands, which apparently has happened in Barnes, where they've just given cones out to local shopkeepers. But there are risks of doing that. And civil servants are willing to take risks now, but unfortunately the engineers don't seem to want to do that. So that's where we're at, and quite happy to answer questions. Thanks.
Mark, we've got a real issue with the Cycleway 9, which they've halted roadworks on because of, obviously, it's not the right time to be doing it. But they could easily have put up a pop-up cycle lane there.
Will Norman said, he tweeted that he wasn't supportive of temporary pop-up lanes because of the issues at junctions. I think that's because TfL's junctions are bigger than most other junctions. I don't know if that meant he was not supportive of doing stuff everywhere else on borough roads or just literally TfL roads.
What a good temporary thing looks like to be genuinely useful for people walking and cycling.
Creating temporary queuing space for walking is different from creating a cycle track or cycle lane temporarily. So the question is what problem you're trying to solve. And okay, I've been told the Barnes example was informal, not formal, and not even sanctioned by the council. But that is a queuing space. And buried at the bottom of the second last bullet point in the Road Traffic Regulation Act 1984 is a sentence which says you are allowed to use traffic powers to improve waiting space for pedestrians queuing on pavements. So it is a legal, it's recognised as a thing that councils can do. So if that's what you're trying to do, then do that. That won't necessarily benefit cyclists, but it'll benefit people queuing, and it'll benefit people who aren't queuing because they can walk past. That's the key problem. They can walk past the queue and give 2 metres to the queue.
Council officers and highway engineers are trained to do like a temporary traffic arrangements and temporary traffic management plans and stuff. So for me, a large part of the case is about making the case for them, showing the evidence of where people can't properly show social distance or where there's issues with speeding cars, and get it over to one authority, because no authority out there at the moment wants to receive some evidence that something's going wrong and not do anything about it for when the great inquest comes in there. So remember, there's people trained to actually do these things. You don't necessarily have to do it yourself, but gathering the evidence is what we all do best here.
If cabinet officers want to put in some restrictions, like block a road completely or block half the road. I gather from what you said, Mark, that they can do it by an experimental traffic order, but I'm wondering what sort of signs and so on that they could get out quickly in a week or two.
There is apparently an approved authorised sign from foot and mouth disease time, which says road closed due to infectious disease. And apparently that's still legally not been withdrawn. Now, it was a very different disease, but you know, those signs are available, and there are designs for them somewhere and pictures, presumably. That's what Hackney are looking at doing. Hackney are looking at implementing a lot of the modal filters that they were already thinking of doing, and they're just going to do them earlier. But the way that they're treating it is it's an experiment. So they're not guaranteeing that this will be permanent. They might have thought of doing it permanently, and that would involve proper consultation, months of discussions and so on. They're going to put them in, and then they can go back as an experiment and say to the locals, well, they've been in now, do you want to keep them? Which is obviously the best experiment anyway, and the best way of consultation.
I'll just say quickly in response to that the market will provide if enough people want something. If there's enough requests into to a local authority to do something, then there are still people working, and we still have people making signs out there, and the market will respond and get stuff done, particularly if it's done in a coordinated way, which is the whole reason that local authorities exist. Part of the case I made when I was talking with Carlton Reader, we did an article on the WHO suggesting that was a lower speed limit in there. I was saying, well, the kids are out at the moment, and it's just the pure science of protecting people during the day. Kids cannot perceive the difference between a 40-mile-an-hour approach speed and a 20-mile-an-hour approach speed in there, and particularly as we know there's some speeding going on there. So going back to the police, it's a question of saying this is important right now. I know it's always been breaking the law, but now it's particularly important because we can't handle any more stress in the hospitals. So I think we can reframe a few arguments to get some positive changes as well.
Coventry passed a 2020 motion in 2014, and we've had about 3 miles of 20 limits since then. So what is stopping, if the council has a blanket policy, what is stopping them just doing this, as we've always argued, on every street as a default?
A letter to the council right now saying this is an issue on our street there, here's the evidence, you should be doing something about this. No one wants to leave those kind of emails hanging at the moment in the middle of an emergency. So I think we can apply the pressure, and we say, look, it's already your existing policy. It's about time you started enforcing it. I think that would be powerful at the moment. That would be my suggestion.
Yeah. Bristol introduced 20, it's widespread across the city actually, and it's also widely ignored. It's not actually enforced. I think the research does show that people do slow down a bit, but you know, not to gainsay the idea of doing it. It's a good idea, and we should use this crisis. You know, never waste a crisis. But it's only as good as the enforcement side. I know it's an obvious point, but worth making.
There's really no roads policing to speak of in Britain, or in a proper sense, and hasn't been since 2010. The exceptions are West Midlands Police and the Met, which is the best resourced of all the police services in Britain. And the Met very much on form with the ultra speeding we're seeing at the moment, which is not just breaking speed limits, is going very much over the speed limits. My view is that calling for lower speed limits isn't actually the priority now. The priority is to actually get enforcement with your local police service. Some of you will have some 20-mile-an-hour roads anyway. I would say on other things, the really noticeable things are that actually nothing much is happening so far. We've had the ones in Richmond, which were done by local businesses, which are a footway extension in effect, using cones. I don't know what's happened to them. Apart from that, Chris Boardman has said he might be doing something. Brighton, similarly, they might be doing something. Councillor Burke in Hackney saying he wants to. you know, nothing much has happened. Actually, even worldwide, if you look at that very good spreadsheet, there's also a guy called Mike Lydon who's added up all the places. Actually, a lot of them are in America, and they're one or two streets. They're not that fundamental. The biggies seem to be Bogota, possibly Budapest, one or two others. So it's not really getting going. And this is a critical time, because if we don't get that road space, there are two things you have to remember. First of all, you are going to have not just speeding, but other problems, because when you get this reduction in traffic, you don't just get the ultra speeders or the greater speeders, you get motorists tending to be less careful, because there's not so much for them to be careful of. It's the Smead curve and reduction of congestion intensity levels. So this is a time when there may be fewer drivers around, but they will tend, all of them, to be a bit less careful, as well as having the temptation to speed. And so we really do have to do something here, a combination of speeding plus making whatever changes we can get to the highway environment. And at the moment, it's not looking good. I mean, what I've had from Will Norman is first of all, he's been saying this thing about, I mean, I hope I'm reporting him correctly. First of all, he's been saying that the workers required do not have key worker status. I'm not sure what the point about that is. I don't know how many people you actually need in a crew to go out with an HGV and put down some cones, or some, you know, even something more like planters. How many would you need who don't have, who are capable of social distancing, could have PPE? So there's a point there. Second point, apparently the Met raised some concerns about filtered permeability would get a lot of people out there not socially distancing. Well, you know, I would say we would need to stand up to that. Thirdly, he had a concern, as you mentioned, about lanes by themselves and not being able to do junction treatments. He is working on something going to the Nightingale Hospital at the Excel, having some kind of temporary cycle lane there. But that's about that. And I've heard of another council that is looking into temporary things, can't mention their name as yet, but it's like looking into things. So it's pretty thin on the ground. I think I'll try and leave it there. Do try and look at the RDRF website. If I'm going to do a follow-up post or add on to it with things that have changed as information comes in. So as information comes in, you can email me at chairrdrf@aol.com, or DM me, or just put it up on Twitter, and I will report what's going on. And that's the basic thing. Another point about policing, if you're on Twitter, when the police do something good, when they seem to be dealing with speeders, just say, well done, lads. You know, it does make a difference. Another minor point, I would say, they are endangering other people. It's not just this NHS stuff that they may hurt themselves and have to go to A&E. And finally, really push this point about how we have to be able to walk and cycle. Very good study in Road CC where they repeated asking cyclists about their mental health. And there's been a massive increase in the proportion of people saying, I need to cycle for my mental health in these current, in this current situation. So it's terribly important.
You know, if the government isn't really, even the local government isn't really doing anything and putting blocks in the way, we need to think about ways of doing it creatively. You know, the whole situation's in flux. There's a lot of silly stuff going on, shutting parks and this and that. you know, I think we need to be creative about it, not confrontational, but just how we can try and do things, you know, positively, which should make a difference, which aren't going to sort of disrupt things too much. And then from the other, I'll be quick. My other point is, I'm vice chair of the Cycling Instructors Union, which has recently been set up, and we're in direct negotiation with Transport for London and the Mayor's Office for our own terms and conditions and pay and stuff like that. But we're also obviously keen to promote cycling as a means of transport, and we sort of talk to all sorts of people from, you know, all our clients, schools, all that. So we kind of know all the issues. So, you know, we want to be part of the conversation to try and sort of help move things along. So, and we've got a petition which I'll give someone a link to forward to everyone, but to sort of support our everyone's got a claim at the moment, obviously, but we're being particularly badly squeezed because of the way we're funded. So I'll leave it there.
Well, thanks for sharing that. That's really interesting. Just wanted to hear a little bit of perspective from Bob while you're there. If you had any thoughts on the kind of whole do-it-yourself, certainly when it comes to like modal filtering and taking care of your own street, agreeing something with your neighbours and doing it directly, or do you think we should be more working with the councils and trying to get something through? Anybody who's got perspective, but I thought Bob might be able to give us a bit of a professional view on that.
Well, first of all, just a quick thing about the cycle instructors. When I mentioned this to Will Norman, he said they're not classified as key workers, which is a big problem. And I would personally like, you know, that's the level that you need to work at, is the central government level, you know, trying to get hold of Mr. Gilligan, trying to work on those kind of levels. I don't know what LCC, Cycling UK, Chris Baldwin and others are actually working on at the moment. But I think you do have to do that. With regard to the councils, obviously to get the councils on board is tremendously important because, you know, the Richmond-on-Thames thing was the local people, was the businesses and some kind of community association who got a hold of a load of cones from somewhere and just put them out there. And I would imagine, you know, that you can call it tactical urbanism or do it yourself or reclaim the streets. If people feel they can do that and that they want to do it and it's the only way they can do it, then they will. But if you're trying to get a change to the highway, there is no substitute, it would seem to me, from approaching them as the highway authority to try and do something which will make a difference to their residents. That's what their duty is. And yeah, you should pastor your councillors and others to say, look, we really do need this in certain areas. Ruth raised the issue of where roadworks have already started. You know, there are a lot of, there is actually in various parts of London, there's quite a lot of traffic still. And a lot of it is people who I don't think are key workers. So, you know, there are areas where there needs to be a general sort of zip and push. And actually, I think if you've got someone more nerdy than any of us, you look back at the history of when road humps first went in, someone somewhere actually said, I'm going to do this. I don't care what the regs are. I'm going to do it. So there's always got to be a bit of daring, but I would, you know, if you've got an Extinction Rebellion group of people who want to do something, then they're going to do something. Personally, it's not, you know, right now with kind of health conditions and what's going on, it's not my personal thing. I think there'd be problems. I don't, you know, if a group of people want to get dressed up in PPE but then, you know, people would say, well, why isn't it going to the nurses? So there are all kinds of issues which campaigners have to kind of work through themselves. And there is no substitute for getting the highway authority to do the right thing. And there is an urgent need. In one sense, because it seems to be going on for a lot longer, we've got a bit of time, but then we've also got people who will say, oh, you don't want to let people out, it's not fair, and there is a speeding traffic, so we can't let the kids out. And so, you know, all the usual problems with campaigning, and the fact that we're actually not in a good place. We haven't got good examples as yet. But, you know, watch this space, and as soon as stuff happens, then it ought to be able to be rolled out as soon as possible.
Yeah, I guess people are shopping locally now. You can't get internet food deliveries as much, so we're forced to go to our local shops to do our shopping. So let's make this as safe as possible. Clearly, on my local street in Hackney, Broadway Market, there was just people queuing out streets. And I'm sure this is common across streets across the country. People queuing outside shops, forcing more children into the road, more cyclists into the road. So let's just create more space on these streets for people to queue and wait. And I guess the idea is really that if we make this as safe as possible, but also actually as less stressful, we can kind of make this sort of behaviour stick in the longer term, which is obviously important for a whole other number of reasons, like for our local economies and for carbon. So it's kind of, we need the space now, and actually if we do make this whole experience more enjoyable and pleasant and rememberable, not a horrible experience, and people might do it in the future. Simple as that. Market streets, shopping streets, and I know there's two different options here. There's filtering. I mean, somewhere like Broadway Market, I mean, really, they've got everything's already set up there to do it immediately. They close once a week anyway. I'm sure there are other streets like that, or filtering streets, or just creating extra space on larger, busier roads. As with, I'm sure I've only just come in, so I don't know what you've been talking about, but using all the other sort of measures for that.
There's currently a bit of an interesting game of cat and mouse going on in Bristol between the council and some residents, where we have a short street, which is it's a very well used access to a popular walking and cycling route with space for social distancing. It's a very short street that has an alternative about 50 metres away. And at the beginning of the pandemic, it was actually closed off due to roadworks, so people were able to spread out across the whole street. Then the roadworks finished a couple of days ago, and the council removed all the barriers and reopened the street to through traffic. And then someone's gone back in and replaced some cones at the entrance to the street, which is great to see. But then apparently today, still watching this unfold, but the council have come back and tried to take away the cones, and then there's been a little bit of a standoff. And at the moment, everything's paused and the cones are still in place. And, and basically the point is, for me, I think, whether you agree with the guerrilla approach or not, I think it's cases like that that are going to be the easiest for us as campaigners to jump on top of and try and push for, because there's already clearly a resident will there. And yeah, it gives us something to jump on and really push publicly.
Well, let me just come back on it first, because something that I was advising today, really, like for the whole low traffic neighbourhood approach, is about getting local people to suggest stuff that we do. The strongest way of suggesting it is this kind of guerrilla approach. And if I was in a position of power, I'd say, well, have a go, talk to your neighbours, put something out there, and then after the end of this crisis, we can consult on, well, do we want all this stuff to say to stay? That would be a really great message.
Brian, I put a Twitter poll just on mine for Brighton and got told, well, who gave you the authority to do a Twitter poll of where in Brighton we should do something? I said nobody, but no one else was doing it. So, and somebody said, why did you try and ask for priorities? I want to do everything. Well, fine, say you want to do everything. But if you keep waiting for a proper formal consultation process with the council doing it, it won't happen during the duration, because council officers are busy doing emergency stuff. And comms people are busy doing emergency comms. So it's the time to step in, maybe not necessarily doing guerrilla things, that's up to individuals, but doing guerrilla assertiveness maybe is the way to put it forward.
Well, that's sensible, yeah. So we're not advocating running out and stopping your streets, but if you did, make a note of it, get some evidence, see what happens. Maybe we'll be able to keep it. It's good time for chatting to your neighbours at a socially safe distance.
As I understand it, putting cones out on roads, there's two potential laws that you might fall foul of. One would be the Highways Act, which I wouldn't really understand, but as I understand, the charge there would be, in a sense, endangering road users, which you're clearly not doing, so you would plead not guilty. Nobody's going to be bundled in the back of police wagons for any of this stuff at the moment, for obvious reasons. The other charge you're going to be levied is criminal damage. Criminal damage is possibly one of the easiest charges to plead not guilty to, because you just lose lawful excuse, very clear lawful excuse, emergency, threat to life because of speeding, and you're protecting life from speeding. And that actually trumps any alleged damage to the highway every time.
Brian, is it an ETRO, the thing that we're looking for? To quote, when you're talking to the Highway Authority, ETRO, Emergency Traffic Regulation Order, or what?
Yeah,
Mark Philpott's advised on this, so speak to Mark, anti-highwayman.
Well, I'll just say you don't necessarily have to worry about the technical process. People might want to do that in slightly different ways as an authority, and just like worry more about getting the evidence, like a photo of some kind of social distancing. We had one in Manchester where someone took a picture of a place in Deansgate where people just couldn't socially distance themselves. There was guardrails, get past each other. That's absolute gold dust. People are, as part of the emergency planning, go, what do we do about that corner? There's people there. What's going on there? So the more evidence that you can get, the stronger the case will be to the council. And it might not go through the standard team that it normally goes through, but everybody's into emergency planning mode, and they want to react to that because we're all trying to lower the death rate, as it were. So it brings out any kind of photo evidence at the moment.
The photographs thing, do stick them up on Twitter or send them to me, because ones where you've got people who can't go into a corner shop without queuing, and if you walk past them, you won't be able to socially distance because the footway isn't wide enough, and there is parking which is causing problems. And get a nice photograph, not with half of it in shade. Those kind of things are gold dust, as Brian.
Given, somebody said, oh, my officers or our officers don't like doing that. There is a role, I think, for those people who are working, I'm looking at Pete if he's here somewhere, those people who are working within local authorities to maybe facilitate a similar thing to this discussion, which is very like the Basecamp Forum, which is closed for local authority staff and so on, to have something that is very much for hidebound local authority engineers talking to others about how they do it on a very professional basis.
Has anyone approached the Department for Transport? Because a lot of the rules that we'd like to change, they will say, well, I'd like to, but we can't because of the DOT. And also that, the APPCGW, whatever they're called now, you've all got the ear of them. Grant Shapps is very proactive travel. We need to really, this is a kind of top-down thing, so it isn't, okay, John Burke's great, other people would like to be great, but then they're hampered by their locals who are vociferous. Harwood Terrace is a horrible example in Fulham, if any of you heard of that one, where the councillors were threatened. So, are any of you who have the ear of government doing anything on that